Let's get going today. For those of you who don't know, I'm Tom. I'm Director at Understanding Solutions, your outcome dedicated resource partner. As we go along today, hopefully there's some very interesting questions. So please put them in the chat as we go along. We'll get to them right at the end where we've got a good Q&A session where you can really grill McMillan. But none of you are here for me, but for my esteemed guest, McMillan. So I'm going to pass over to you, just a brief introduction, and we'll get into transformation governance.
Amazing. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you very much, Tom, for having me. And yeah, looking forward to this session. A little bit about me, just to introduce myself. I've spent the past 15 years sort of being involved in as well as leading transformation programs. I've done this across diverse sectors, including media, professional services, large-scale engineering, and financial services, often sitting at the intersection between strategy, operations, and technology. Governance is really one of those topics that can sound very procedural, but in reality, it's the difference between transformation that it actually is measurable and delivers value, and one that has the potential to stall. So today, really, we want to unpack what governance really means beyond the bureaucracy and to share some really practical hands-on experience as well as applications and toolkits that people can take away and actually apply. In terms of key takeaways from today's session, really, there's really three key things that I'd like to everyone to sort of take away as key outcomes. The first is really getting a better understanding and clarifying what governance is and what it isn't. The second is really being able to have a deeper understanding in terms of how governance really drives clarity, speed, and value. And then thirdly, it's really having a practical framework that you can take away with real world scenario or lessons that really you can take away that makes governance actually work in practice.
Thank you. And before we get into actually what governance is, I'd actually be keen to get your thoughts on how would you actually describe digital transformation? Because it can be thrown around quite a lot and used in probably scenarios where it doesn't need to be. So I'll be keen to get your opinion. What actually is digital transformation to you?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Tom. And there's many interpretations of what transformation is, and it tends to be one of those terms that are sometimes thrown around very loosely. But by transformation, I'm talking about operational and technology-led change. So, in other words, it's really about fundamentally improving how a business runs, whether you're scaling operations, driving efficiency, or embedding a new technology to enable that growth. We're not talking about tweaking processes here, Tom. We're talking about reshaping them to meet future demands. And often when I talk about strategy, it's really related to strategy execution because that future demand is really related to the concept of where do we want to be and then leveraging technology or the change to actually achieve that and enable that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So should we get into it? What is governance?
Yeah, before we get into it, yeah, in terms of what governance is, to make it maybe stick and a bit more real life for people who have joined, I want to use a quick example, and I'm going to use the example of Formula One. And I'm sure everybody is familiar with Formula One or would have seen a Formula One race at some point. If not, there's a brilliant show on Netflix called Drive to Survive. So if
I
you
think I've
haven't
seen
seen
it
it,
before.
I encourage everybody to see it to have a concept of what Formula One is. But essentially, in every Formula One race, there's a moment called a pit stop. It's really that moment where the car pulls up into a pit stop, and within seconds, the entire crew swarms around it, changes all four tires, and makes adjustments and gets it back on track. Now, interestingly enough, 20 years ago, a pit stop took around 7 to 10 seconds. And today, that whole process takes about 1.8 seconds. In fact, it's 1.78 seconds. That's how quick it is. So the question is, what changed? The cars did improve. Yes, that's true. The cars are a lot quicker, and as technology has progressed, cars are doing. But something bigger happened. The real difference is really governance. And I'll tell you why. Every person in that pit crew knows exactly what they're responsible for, who gives the signal, and what decisions trigger which actions. So there's no second guessing in that moment. There's no
Mm.
committee meetings on the track. It's clarity, coordination, and accountability in motion. And that's governance. It's not about the bureaucracy, but it's really about decision enablement in that moment. It's what allows teams to move faster and not slower. So in transformation programs, and similarly, whether you're doing this across media, professional services, large scale engineering, financial service, or whatever the sector, the same principles apply. When governance is strong, essentially everybody knows their role in the change process, when to act, when to escalate, and what decisions they own. When it's weak, on the other hand, it's like a pit crew that hasn't practiced, right?
Mm.
People trip up, mistakes happen, and there's magnified delays and opportunities are lost. That's not to say transformation is perfect, but good governance really aids it. So when we talk about governance today, think about it less about the red tape and more about that pit stop precision where everybody knows what to do, when to do it, and how to keep performance at its peak. So in transformation, governance is that engine room then that enables that speed. And it's not about slowing things down, it's about ensuring speed, but doing so in the right direction, getting everybody to move in the right direction.
Interestingly, and I think to dig into that, I think everyone on this webinar has hopefully been through a transformation. They probably understand how stressful and hard it is. So
Yeah.
why do transformations struggle and fail when governance is weak or even absent in some cases?
Yeah. The way I look at it from my experience, Tom, it's multiple factors, right? There's both singular and multiple, and I talk about singular or multiple factors because there could be an area within that governance structure, that framework that is really poor, that causes governance to really be under pressure and be fragmented and fail, or it could be small failures that accumulate. Let me bring this to life. So when governance is weak, the biggest failure point from my experience, as an example, is decision latency. And what decision latency is, decisions don't get made at the right time, and most importantly, by the right people. So what happens is you start to see misalignment between the vision, execution, and accountability. And what happens is slowly teams start to drift, risks start to pile up, and you end up being in a state of reacting instead of steering. So, and in a multi-causal environment, you may see up to three. One, where decision latency, where decisions just don't get made, right? Or there's a slow, they're not made at the pace that's needed. Or ultimately, decisions are made, but there's constant backpedaling, people changing their mind after, and there isn't robust or change controls as a part of that process. And there's nothing that, if you've ever been in a transformation, that causes more tension and frustration than having decisions that are made and then backpedaling in terms of those decisions. And really good governance is really needed to make sure that we stick and those decisions are enforced. And then lastly, it's unclear lines of accountability. And this is more common in sort of more complex and multi-matrix organizations, like larger scale transformation programs, especially the one I've seen it across multiple geographies. When you're looking at integrating a tool across the UK, US, or multiple geographies, that
Mm.
scale and complexity then cause that in terms of that line of accountability, decisions, and outcome ownership. And the key question becomes, who really is ultimately the key decision maker? And that's something that we really need to call out as part of that can cause tension and failure within a governance process.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into that a little further. But before we do that, I'd be quite interested to get your thoughts on culture is obviously a big thing, especially when transformation comes in. I'm sure we all know some stubborn stakeholders, probably a few on the call as well. But how do you actually go about getting buy-in from your point of view, from the senior stakeholders that actually make those decisions?
That's a good one. And I'll cover culture in a bit more detail, but maybe let me tackle the point around getting, the senior leadership point and how do we make sure that we take senior leaders on the journey and making them aware of the benefits or the value of having good governance.
Mm,
The way I see it is I frame governance as an insurance policy for execution speed, really. It's one of those things, it's either you invest upfront and building that clarity now and building that capability and making sure that everybody's aligned, or you spend 5 times more time or more of the effort firefighting later and when the
yeah,
program or the project is in flight, right? So the key thing is linking that governance piece to tangible business value, right? And being able to demonstrate how will this governance really enable speed, how does it reduce risk, and how does it help us achieve benefits and really realize that benefits realization piece, which is really key. And a key tool that I leverage here is using data. And a key example is to show how governance can shorten decision turnaround, can increase benefits delivered, or potentially can help reduce change fatigue, which is a really important part that people need to consider when delivering programs. Is what's their change impact, and how do we make sure that people don't get change fatigued, and we carefully assess this, and good governance can help sell that in terms of that's a value add that the leadership can have visibility on that. So once leaders see these metrics, whether it's the decision SLA, benefits realization, risk closure ratio, then we can start to demonstrate why we need to make this upfront investment to avoid those pitfalls as we sort of progress.
I guess like an option is always not to do it as well, right? Like if you can't prove it with the data, maybe actually doing transformation for transformation's sake is not the right thing to do, right?
No, it's definitely not the right thing. You don't want to create structures for the sake of creating structures, but you want those structures to actually create and deliver value, both for the teams and for the stakeholders, because you don't want to quickly lose credibility with people.
Yeah, yeah. So going back to the decision making, you can go into an organization, culture will obviously play a part of this, but how do you go about making the decision of who makes what decision, who doesn't make those decisions, and how do you go about maybe changing that within an organization, which historically, whatever 12 people have been making every decision since then, and it's not going to work with good governance, right? So,
Absolutely.
um,
And this is common, and it's a great question, Tom. I think it's really one that comes a lot within the transformation work. And for me, effective governance is really about clarity and proportionality. And when I
mm,
talk about that proportionality element, it's really about matching that decision architecture to three core things, essentially. It's the pace, the complexity, and the culture of the organization. And you see it differently, and I've done this across multiple environments. So in a startup and scale up environment, the decision architecture can be more flat because you can get decisions, and the speed in which you're moving can be a lot quicker. Where in sort of more larger, complex multinational organizations or large organization, the speed and complexity, if you move too quickly, you can lose people. So you need to make sure that you balance it, and it's a refinement. So you have to adjust the structure to enable decisions and not slow them down. So from a practical framework perspective, I start by asking three fundamental questions. The first question is, what decisions genuinely need escalation versus what can be delegated? What decisions can be escalated versus what can be actually delegated? Number two, how fast do decisions need to move to keep delivery on track? So for us to be able to meet the timelines and objectives, how fast do we need to make decisions? And we need to get buy-in here. And then third thing is, where does accountability sit? And I talk about strategic, I talk about design, and I talk about delivery. So, and then you create what we call a multi-tier governance model that really is there to ensure or enforce this element in terms of what keeps these decisions on track and close to the ground. And a practical framework that I use is, in a small organization, you may use a 3-tier model or 4-tier model, and in a large organization, you may use potentially a 6-tier model. And I'll get into the tiers now. So at the top, you have a strategic or portfolio board. So it's a strategic, it's either a steerco, as it's commonly called, as you might have seen it, or a strategic or portfolio board. And this is really where priorities, funding, benefits alignments is set, and it defines the what we're trying to achieve and ensures that every major investment is trackable to business outcomes. And then below that, you can have an added layer, a more focused layer, which can be a review board. And this actually acts as an assurance layer. What it does for the program is it challenges progress, it validates the business readiness, and it makes sure that things like benefits are tracked without getting lost in every detail. It is quite a strategic layer and also can be involved in escalated interdependency matters to help unpack those. And then you get the program level, really, which is really driven by the program board, which can manage, which really is really to manage the dependencies, sequencing of the program, and manage the risk across the diverse work streams. And that layer is really where the delivery realities meet strategic intent. So, and alongside that program layer, there's an element where we need to think about how we're designing a solution or how we configuring it. And that's really the design authority. So, which is critical. That design
Mm.
authority, it's the how layer. It brings together the architecture, the privacy, the security, the operations, and involves the leadership team. So the senior leadership team is involved here because they need to take that information back to those areas and really need the input from their teams and those SMEs to make sure that they actually are as effective in practice. So to be able to move in a fast and compliant manner. And then you've got the other layer, which is workstream governance. So workstream is really the day-to-day. So day-to-day decision engine. It's where things like agile ceremonies happen. It's where like sprint reviews happen. It's where the quick course correction actually happens in practice. And every tier has a clear remit if you think about these tiers. So most importantly, we decide on the cadence around and the rhythm of these programs depending on the need. So for example, you might have a portfolio or a steer code once a month, or you may have a review board once a month. You may have a design authority fortnightly. You may embed a program level cadence or weekly, and then you may have what we call the work streams have daily routines or with sort of like stand-ups, and you have that to make sure that you're constantly keeping the program on track. So
Mm.
in terms of when you look at it, it's really making sure that decisions are clear. There's a clear data flow in terms of how things must go. And most importantly, you take into consideration the culture of the organization. Don't create undue complexity, but also make sure that you involve every key and critical stakeholder um, who needs to be involved as part of the process. So then, Tom, the next question becomes who should be involved in it? Like, who are the different players within that structure and that framework? So, in terms of who the players are and the stakeholders, that you have multiple layers. The first one, you have the executive sponsor, who's often a member of the executive leadership team. Could be a COO, could be an executive, could member, could even be an SLT, depending on the scale and the size of the organization. And this is really the role, someone who sets the direction, who signs off that investment, essentially. And then you have a program director and leadership who really conveys the strategy to execution. And that's really where often I sit in terms of making sure that I convert that strategy into execution. And then we have a design authority and who are made up of the leadership team and SMEs, and sometimes you can involve SMEs to ensure consistency, compliance, and that technical coherence. And then you have the project or workstream leads or delivery leads, depending on different naming conventions, who really execute and manage the day-to-day on each work stream. And then you have that assurance layer, right? We want to make sure that audit is involved, that the assurance team is involved, and we have the PMO here who maintain that transparency and quality. So together, this gives a 360 governance structure, 360-degree governance structure that looks at the strategic ownership, it looks at the operational control, it looks at the design and integrity, and it looks at the independent oversight, which keeps transformation fast, aligned, and auditable. So in short, it's really about making sure that everybody knows their lane, just like that example of the F1 pit stop analogy, so that
Mm.
governance feels natural and not like a burden.
Do you feel like there's an optimum size for this, within the team size? Because it seems obviously a lot of groups, which is needed, but too many cooks, I guess.
Yeah, that's a very good one. It's about really understanding who needs to be in the room. It's asking the question, who needs to be in the room and what role do they play?
Mm.
If you are in the room and you're not contributing and you're not looking at a vantage point that anybody else that's a unique vantage point, then you shouldn't be in that room. That's how I would frame it, right? So in previously, for example, in a program structure, I would have the workstream leads, where whether it's the change management lead, you would have the SME, the subject matter expert, the operational expert, you would have technology, you would have data, you would have the positive implement. So everybody has a role, and it's not a cost of thousands. And again, unless the person has a different vantage point and you can articulate what is it they're doing and what contribution are they playing in their room, then they shouldn't be in their room.
Mm. And I guess maybe practically, how would you implement this? Would you put this in stuff like performance management and other sort of weekly catch up? How would you make sure that it then delegates all the way down?
Yeah, that's a good one. So if you, as a program director, I'm often responsible for setting this infrastructure up. So normally I work with the leadership team, whether it's executive sponsor, to kind of shape what this will look like, as well as the key workstream leads. So again, understanding the complexity of the organization and the key decisions that need to be made. And it all starts with, what decisions do we need to make? How do we make decisions in this organization, and what's the optimal structure for enabling this, right? Within more complex organization, there's already an overarching sort of governance structure that's embedded, and it's about you fitting in that model to make sure that it actually works and in a practical way. So you can define it. What I like to do when I come in, I assess where the program is, what decisions will need to be made, and then based on that and understanding the culture and having engagements with the executive, with the executive sponsor, then we will craft this in terms of making sure that it's fit for purpose for that particular organization. And some organizations want it lean. You don't want a cost of 1,000, and in smaller startup scale up, you may have even CEO, COO, FD involved as that executive layer in terms of signing things off, and then you may have an SLT, and then you may have just your delivery team in terms of it may be a lot flatter. It depends, but that's why it's important for you to align with the executive, but also driving that understanding in terms of what is it that we need to achieve, what's the fastest way, how quickly do we need to make those decisions, and then who do we need in the room to help facilitate those decisions. So that's my recommendation.
Is it possible to even calculate the ROI of good governance in a program? Because usually it's one of those safety nets that you need. You only know when it's gone bad, right? It's a bit hard to measure it then.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, first of all, that everything that we do within a governance element should be measured to business outcomes. What are we trying to achieve? And how does this help us achieve things like benefit realization? So you got to tie to KPIs, whether it's risk metrics, and have a benefits dashboard and look at how you're leveraging data to drive this. So you can measure key things like decision turnaround times, benefits realized versus forecast, and risk closure rates, in terms of how quickly we're able to make decisions. So, and the metrics will then deliver that measurable value. So a lot of the times that I've come across and I've spoken to organizations and leaders, they really struggle with this benefit realization piece. And a good way, even from pilot, from a moment where we've gone through from a discovery, we've gone through the process, we've launched a pilot to kind of validate that, we can start to actually track benefits. We can start to then surface those high level KPIs and really show the value of the governance structure and really what it's allowed. And then we call it telemetry, that real time visibility and dashboarding to kind of show that progress. And this is where it really then drives that value to surface challenges early, but also to keep the leadership abreast in terms of how the value and the ROI is actually coming along as a result of the infrastructure.
Yeah. Also, I'm quite interested to know, right, now transformation is ongoing, right? And undoubtedly at one point something's going to go wrong, right? How do you escalate that? How do you make it feel like, right, we know there's an issue, but we're going to solve it sooner rather than later, rather than let it manifest?
Yeah, that's a very good question. In terms of that, the most critical thing in every transformation is what every executive and leadership who are contemplating transformation should think about is psychological safety. Okay, because escalations only work when it's clear in terms of how the escalation process works. And number two, there's a psychological safety. And I read something the other day that says, in great organizations, it's great because people feel comfortable to actually point out the problems. Because if people don't feel comfortable pointing out the problems, then you can never solve the problems. People just hide the problems. So that's a key thing we need to think about, right? So I tend to set thresholds. For example, if an issue exceeds X amounts of days, or there's a financial impact associated with that, then there's a clear escalation. You need to escalate that immediately. And also within that risk element, you could have a risk rating, risk register or RAID log. Which kind of can log all your risks and then kind of create a threshold and then a cadence in terms of when and how should we escalate these. But actually, we say escalation isn't about blame, it's a
Mm.
signal for support. And that's key, right? It isn't about, oh, you did this. And it's important to have a team that understands that and to drive that culture within transformation. It's not about blaming each other, it's really signaling for support. And that's framing encourages early, honest escalations, which is really important in being able to drive things forward from a transformation lens.
And I guess going on from that, right? How do you approach things differently from, if you're going in at the start of a transformation, hope you can set the governance up effectively. But if you're coming in maybe as a bit more of a rescue mission where governance hasn't been there, things aren't going wrong, and those issues are apparent, and there needs to be resolved. Do you approach it slightly differently? How do you go around that?
Yes. The difference There's a difference in the capabilities required to come into a program versus a planned transformation, right? Or a planned transformation versus a rescued transformation. And the difference is really about the starting point. In a rescue scenario, you're coming in to fix something that's gone off track, and there's multiple reasons for it's gone off track. Somebody could have left the business, could be leaving the business or a key resource. There could be challenges with the delivery partner. There could be challenges and delays within the timeline from a technology readiness gaps. There could be challenges with interdependencies that weren't accounted for, or there could be stakeholder misalignment that's going on within that particular portfolio project or program. And you have a bit of a firefighting outlook first. So you have to come in, problem solve, and then kind of steer the ship back on track. So it's a different capability.
Mm.
Where if you think about it from a planned transformation perspective, you have the luxury of setting those expectations from day one, right? Mapping out the interdependencies and making sure the foundation is solid before you scale. So the key difference there is that rescue is more reactive,
Yeah.
and a planned transformation is more proactive and strategic in nature. So the capabilities and the thinking and your approach and the mindset that you approach these two scenarios is slightly different in terms of what you need to do. Within coming in, when you're rescuing it, you need to come in, add impact, sort of immediately firefight, get it under control, establish credibility quickly, bring back the stakeholders and re-energize and realign everybody. Whereas if you coming in from day one, you set that up front, you map up those dependencies, you map up those key things, and you track it more proactively and more strategically.
Awesome. And I think I can imagine one of the issues has been difficult stakeholders as part of that, right? How do you deal with diverse stakeholders, maybe like conflicting priorities between departments, and how do you maybe align them in maybe what is, I don't know, culturally a little bit sensitive, something that's, people feel worried about. It can be a bit complex, I guess.
Yeah, and this is often a challenge when it comes to transformation, right? You have different stakeholder interests. And I always say if you're involved in transformation at whatever level, whether you work stream lead, whether you're a program manager, whether you're a program director, whether you're an executive, like no matter where you are, like one of the capabilities that I have that you need to develop as a program leader is really being able to understand the competing personalities in the room in terms of your stakeholders and the different interests, because everybody in there, and it's a natural thing, we are selfishly looking out for how does this benefit, what is my vantage point of this engagement, and that's often the question. So to mitigate against that, you need to anchor decisions on shared purpose and not departmental goals. So I establish a decision principles. And this is often in a design setting, you could have design principles that guide us in terms of how we actually get to decisions from a design perspective. But you could have high level focus. And an example of this is the customer impact trumps internal preference, right? So the benefits
Mm.
realization. Number two, you could look at things like you optimize for speed over perfection. And I used to have an ex-CEO who say, "Don't let perfect get in the way of good enough." Sometimes we have to understand that good enough is good enough, and we have to. It's enough to get things going because you're always iterative in your approach, and you're always learning and always refining in terms of how you deliver things. And then
Yeah.
lastly, it's principles depersonalize conflict and keep decisions value driven and not political. So it's what are our common values or the common things that we are committing to as everybody in this room, all the way from the most senior person to everybody who's involved. And again, it's giving everybody an equal voice. It's almost like when you go into that space, in those spaces, you respect the channels, but you give everybody an equal voice, and we are driven by the values, the shared values and the shared purpose over individual interests. And that's for me is really really key in setting those principles.
Interesting. And I guess we live in the real world, right? And there's one thing setting it up exactly how you want it to look like, but then there's always external factors internally that affect that, right? So do you ever like compromise on what good governance is because you just know that it's going to do more harm than good?
Yeah, it is. It's a conversation, right? It's a conversation. It's never perfect in reality, right? It's about understanding that and having the ability to problem solve and to understand people and being able to problem solve is really, really, really the key thing. And understanding that you sometimes need to be able to make tough decisions, and you should be empowered as a program leader to make tough decisions, because some people, it may just be that that person or that personality isn't the best thing for the program or the point or what we are trying to achieve or that transformation initiative, and we need to make decisions to move people around. And sometimes it actually happens, Tom. We need to move people around who are not positive for the team, because it's all about what drives us forward and what gets us the outcome. And sometimes there will be a clash. And if that's disruptive to what we are trying to achieve, we have to make those tough decisions. Otherwise, what we are trying to achieve can become compromised. So that's a key thing as well.
Good. I've got a final couple questions, and we'll pass it over to the chat. But very quickly, tell me how it feels and looks like when you're in good governance. When you're in your mid projects. There's a lot of people on here that are doing transformations, I'm assume, right? And they're probably trying to maybe figure out how much of it appeals to them or not.
Yeah, that's a very good question. If you're leading transformation, there's a couple of things. What good looks like in good governance is it's clear ownership of decision and risks. It's really predictable meeting cadence and information flow, making sure that there's constant communication in terms of where, fast escalation and resolution cycles, benefits that are tracked to business outcomes. It's always about what problems does this solve for the business, or what opportunity does this help us capitalize on. Those are the key things. And then it's about having engaged, empowered stakeholders, right? It's about giving the team that and making sure people are engaged, but also making sure people feel empowered. And it's working when issues are surfaced early, decisions are made fast, and teams feel supported rather than policed. And this goes across all layers as well, where and
Mm.
everybody is clear in terms of their role in removing blockers and making sure that we continue to push through and make good progress.
Yeah, nice. And then on the flip side,
On the flip side, it feels painful to say the least. It feels over engineered with a lot of bureaucracy, and it's governed by templates and not purpose. It's unempowered decision makers. It's too many cooks and not enough leadership or clear lines of accountability. So it's blurry lines of accountability, and it's treating governance as compliance, not enablement.
yeah,
So and the fix is complex but simple in terms of you need to design governance with the teams. So, and not for them ideally. I think I've mentioned this. So it's about collaboratively with the people you're going into this journey with, partnering with them, and to really make them co-creators so they have joint ownership of the actual process, and it becomes a part of how they work and not another layer of paperwork.
yeah. Because I can imagine maybe both feel real to some people, right? Somewhere in the middle. And what one practical thing would you say to someone to get maybe they're somewhere in the middle to get more onto the good side than the bad side? Where should they start?
In terms of where people should start, it starts by mapping things out. It starts with a clear accountability in terms of it starts with a simple RACI, right? Like who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, who needs to be informed. It's a simple framework. That's a good starting point. It's also about understanding what decisions need to be made, how quickly do we need to make this decision to move things along, and number three, what is the impact of the change we're delivering? A simple change impact assessment goes an incredibly long way of understanding decision fatigued. Who are we, and then making sure that people are in your leadership team certainly are all a part of it. You need people to buy into what we're doing and be bounded by those common values, as I mentioned, as a key thing, rather than and those key principles rather than selfish interest. Understanding those selfish interests and finding a way to also address them is also optimal.
Nice, nice. And I think final one before I put it into the group for some questions. So do get them in there now. Can you bring it all to life? Maybe good share like a real life example and how it came about.
Yeah. A good example to bring, for example, is in a large scale implementation. For a client, one of the challenges we had was related to scope creep. So the principle that was adopted was everything is in scope unless. And that's one of my key lessons, right? So if you have that becomes, even though there's a defined scope of what that parameters should look like, unless you have a tight lid in terms of we know definitively what is in scope and what is not in scope, and there's a clear line of parameters, then your governance and your change control process isn't going to be effective. So that's one of the key lessons that I learned, is that never have a program or a project with indefinite scope, because you need to have things kind of sealed off definitively, which is what you would think is project management 101. But but in trying to abstract and optimize the value that a transformation can bring, sometimes companies can be really ambitious in terms of how doing it. And also the realization around a time scale in terms of what it actually takes to deliver something. And sometimes that calls for resetting, and really being able to challenge that and creating an environment and a governance cadence where, decisions that we've made pre-presumption, which were made forecasted at the beginning of the transformation journey, should be allowed to be continually challenged on the basis of new information, right? And a simple example of this is in a program where, in a similar program where there's a delay in a piece of technology readiness, and we know it's not going to, we have an interdependency on another program, and that program or that is delayed. So we know that that's not going to land. It's about making compromises. It's creating that framework to say, okay, fine, do we want to take this forward and have and compromise and have a lot of manual workarounds, or do we just want to wait a bit and make sure we actually divide and actually deliver what we promised? So, and manage that the expectations as well. That's really key. And when I talk about expectation management, is let's define: is this transformative in nature, or is this incremental and will be transformative over time? And there's a difference. A transformative piece meaning when it lands and it goes live, it's going to fundamentally have changed the way people kind of operate. Therefore, that change will be visible. Or it's one of those that it's going to be there, but it's going to be there over time. So let's set the expectation so people know what to expect as well. So those are the key things from a practical advice. And then also make sure that you're cohesive as a unit. So, and make sure that programs are really rooted in good frameworks and good communication to enable that effective governance cadence and structure.
Good. Well, thank you very much. I've got a couple of questions here, a couple of quick fires. What's the best tool for managing governance?
Tool wise, best I mean, there's so many tools on the market. It's about what people really want to use. I like smart sheets. They can be quite interactive. Jira is good. Power BI, anything for me that visualizes data in a way that allows us to tell the story, that's really, really good. But considering that, telling a story is one thing, but behavior makes the difference.
Yeah, good. Is there like a certain cadence that people should meet?
Yes, I think cadence is a key. It should be a rhythm that feels organic and feels quite good in terms of making sure there's information flow. So should have a weekly cadence, fortnightly, potentially a fortnightly cadence, with things like design authority, and I would say program level, it should be about weekly. And I would recommend that the work streams and the teams talk on a day-to-day basis. And then obviously the more strategic elements, you want to filter them so that you have enough traction, enough things have happened, but you want to keep those escalation channels open to be able to escalate things quickly. So maybe monthly for the more strategic piece, but it's got to be adjusted to what feels right for the pace, complexity, as well as the culture of the organization. That's really, really the key.
So no specific, just adjust accordingly type of thing. Whatever feels right. If it feels too much, what a question from me would be, interestingly, what happens if people are listening to this, right, and maybe governance isn't being adhered to as they would want, right, and there's some clear issues in there, but they're not in control of the program, they're not playing that program director role, right? Would you have any advice of how someone could maybe address that effectively?
Yes, I think you could do a quick audit in terms of the governance cadence. If you don't have the capabilities, you could partner with, there's people like myself. There's a lot of people. You could get help in terms of how do you audit your governance process is probably the key thing. And then most importantly, you could look at also key things like, okay, what's the impact? How is this affecting our delivery? And how is this affecting our stakeholders? That may be a good starting point. What's the change impact assessment across for the lack of governance? And then that creates the business case for saying, yes, is this something that we really critically need to do something about? And more than happy to help. Or, there's a lot of good transformation content and discourse out there that can really steer. But I think it works best when you always have some level of expertise that come in and help with those type of scenarios.
Yeah, I can imagine. Unless anyone's got any more questions, I'll pass it back over to you. You got any final words before we wrap up?
Yes. Thanks very much for having me. It's been absolutely brilliant to kind of share on this topic of governance. It's a really, really important topic in driving effective transformation and ensuring that we take people along with us on the journey of change, and that we deliver both operational and technology-led transformation in a way that lands, that sticks, and that really drives optimal business value. In terms of key takeaways, just 5 quick ones. The first one is governance should equal decision enablement and not paperwork. 2, keep it lean, clean, and value focused. And number three, escalate early. And again, it's a signal for support and let's not blame. And number four, integrate performance data into governance rhythm and make sure that you're telling the story through data. And number five, anchor everything in shared purpose and benefits realization. So, if as a quick tip is map one decision flow in your program or your project and outline who decides on what and how quickly. And if you can't explain it in under a minute, then that's your first governance improvement opportunity to then see how you can actually refine your processes so that they are actually efficient and quick and very clear for everybody, and they put in plain English, as we like to put it.
Amazing. Well, look, thank you very much for attending. If this conversation sort of resonates with you, or maybe some of those issues ring a little bit too true and too close to home, we'll happily take this offline. We can give you some more practical, more specific advice of how to implement good transformation governance. So just reach out to myself or McMillan directly. But thank you again for everyone. I hope you all found this useful. We'll be back in the new year with a new webinar. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Cheers, everyone. Thank you, Tom.
Bye.